My brother loved technology, and we would talk sometimes about trends in technology, and he would talk about convergence, how new forms of media and communication would unite to create new ways to interact and learn. But when I think about convergence, I think about something very different. I think about the paths that my life took and Jeremy's life took, and how over the last 20 years we found convergence with each other. Like many siblings, when we were teenagers, our paths diverged. I was only 11 when Jeremy left for college at MIT. He didn't come home from college very often, and then he went straight to Israel. This was the early 1980s when phone calls were expensive, email wasn't really available, and we had little opportunity to have that kind of daily communication that brothers really need. I can still remember it to this day, even when I got to college, just how difficult it was to reach Jeremy by phone or to send email or to find other ways to stay in contact. But that started to change 20 or so years ago. Jeremy spent a year in the United States, the first time he battled cancer, and we spoke often over the phone during that year. Later, as we were both married and raising children, we found that our interests and our goals in life had started to converge, and we had many, many things to talk about. Even in the business world, our interests started to converge. My work in patent law interacted with his work in technology, and in recent years, Jeremy had become very interested in intellectual property, to where I could once come here to Israel to give a speech and see Jeremy out there in the audience applauding. But more importantly, we found time over the last recent years to engage and talk more about Jewish identity, and to talk about the challenges that face Jews in Israel, Jews in America, raising children with Jewish identity. And I found more reasons to come to Israel more often and spend time in person with Jeremy. And even when I was home, we found ways to make sure we stayed in touch by phone and by email and by Skype. And we began to find that we had issues to discuss and topics that we loved to discuss that we would never have imagined as children. Jeremy had a way of drawing on different sources in Jewish literature and halacha and finding a path that would combine scholarly intensity and yet a sense of joy and humor. When I was flying over here and we were changing airplanes, my wife called me and she said she had taken our girls over to a friend's house that night, and a question had come up. For some reason, someone talked about grafting fruit and whether or not the resulting fruit was kosher. And my wife said every instinct in her body wanted to go to the computer and write an email to Jeremy, because that's who we would discuss these issues with. She had become so accustomed to seeing his response with lots of thoughtful things to dive into, and always with a pun and a joke at the end. Somewhere in there she knew if he were still with us, he would have made a joke about mixed fruits and mixed nuts. Jeremy's voice was also deeply connected to the land of Israel. And by this I mean his connection went beyond halacha, beyond religious observance. There was a fundamental and very deep peace that Jeremy found, and really only found here in the land of Israel. And somehow I think I knew that even when I was a small child. We made only one trip to Israel when we were little. I was 7, and Jeremy was 11 and a half. And I think back now, and there's so little from your childhood that you really remember from when you were a small boy. Most of what you remember are the stories that your parents and others have retold you over the years. But there is one vision from my childhood that has stuck very clearly with me, that I know is my own vision and not a story anyone else told me. I can remember sitting with Jeremy during that trip in our hotel room at the Mariah Hotel, or what was then the Mariah Hotel, and we made paper airplanes for hours. We made dozens and dozens and dozens of paper airplanes. We had squadron after squadron of fighter planes prepared for the defense of the land of Israel. And I think back all those years, and why did that memory stick with me? There are so many other things I could have remembered from that trip, so many other things growing up with Jeremy I could have remembered. And I think that stuck with me because sitting there with Jeremy, just doing the everyday things in the land of Israel, there was something different about him here. There was a sense of peace and joy that I think even as a 7-year-old, I saw in my brother at that young age. And I saw that side of Jeremy again, a sense of calm and pride and the way he would greet my girls when I brought them to Israel. I have 2 girls, they're 8 and 10 years old now, and I was fortunate to bring each of them just by themselves on a one-on-one trip when they were in 1st grade. I brought Rachel, my oldest, in 2009 to celebrate Chaim's bar mitzvah, and I brought Naomi in 2011 to celebrate Jeremy's 50th birthday. Jeremy treated the arrival of each of my girls as if they were a visiting princess, and through his eyes, they saw a connection to the land of Israel that was unique. It was a sense of time and place that even they, as a 7-year-old, could appreciate through his eyes. When my girls returned to the U.S., their teachers at school would comment to us, completely unsolicited, how not only did the girls come back with a new connection to Israel, but that fundamentally something in our girls had changed. They had a new sense of confidence and peace in themselves after those trips with Jeremy. I saw Jeremy in May, a few weeks ago, and we spent a lot of our time during that week talking about different ways we could approach a bat mitzvah for my oldest, Rachel, that she'll be having in 2 years. Jeremy was looking for ways to help us build a ceremony that would fit the egalitarian world in which my girls are raised in the U.S., but which would still be comfortable for Jeremy from a halachic perspective. And to Jeremy, this was not an obstacle. This was a challenge. And it was something that he was trying to wrestle with, to look for options and solutions. It saddens me greatly that Jeremy will not be with us to see those simchas, but his ideas and the enthusiasm he brought to starting to plan those simchas are already very much ingrained in my girls. I never did get the chance to remind Jeremy about the paper airplanes we made in 1972, but perhaps it was something that he had remembered too. When it came time for Jeremy to serve in the IDF, he chose the Air Force. And he spent his time in reserves teaching physics to pilots, probably drawing on those squadrons of paper airplanes that we made so many years earlier. Jeremy's path continues here, through Lisa and Shachar and Chaim, and through all the lives that he touched and all the people he knew him, when I had the chance to share some of the energy he drew from the land of Israel.